Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you again. We're going to get our little science nerdy thing on today. Are you a science nerd? Do you like things that make you go, That song, mate. The things that make you go, We're going to do that today on the show. We're going to take something that's quite elaborate, something that you really got to stretch your brain around, and then apply it to podcasting. Are you ready? I don't think I've had any podcast about podcasting ever go down this path. I'm excited you're here with me. Are you ready? We're going to blind you with science today here on the podcast. Here we go.
She blinded me with science.
So if you know what that's from, you're old like me, and welcome to the club. Anyway, so we're talking today about the second law of thermodynamics. And you're like, what, Dave? What happened? What happened to you? Why are we talking about the second law of thermodynamics? I want to talk to you about how entropy can cause your podcast to break down over time. And you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm going to have to go Google all these words. No, we're going to break them all down for you so you understand what's happening here. And that you can maybe get something out of this conversation that you can apply directly to your podcast today. These are some of the ideas and things that come to my head at around 2:48 a.m. when I'm at work. I'm like, oh, I got to talk to you about this. And I write them down on little scrap pieces of cardboard that I cut off boxes that I'm using in the warehouse where I work. And I write down these notes. I stick them in my pocket. I come home. And then months later, I have this mountain hill of cardboard pieces with random scribbles on them of inspiration in the moment that I have to then figure out, what the heck was I writing here? And this was one of those little pieces of cardboard. So I have it here in front of me. And I thought, I want to talk about this because I think there's something here that other podcasts about podcasting, they don't talk about. And I wanted you to hear my thoughts on this. Now, the second law of thermodynamics, I'll put a whole definition and stuff in the show notes. But to summarize and put it into our terminology, it's basically the idea of this. If you took something you bought, say something brand new, and you say a car, okay, and you put it out into your driveway, and then you just never touch it. You don't drive it, you don't move it, you just let it sit there. And you just let it sit there for years, like say 40 years. That brand new car that's never gone anywhere except from the dealership to your house, to your driveway. You haven't moved it. You haven't turned it on. You haven't run it. You haven't done anything with it. In general terms, the second law of thermodynamics is that things that are left to their own tend to break down over time. They don't tend to get better. They tend to get worse. And a car that's never driven and just parked in the driveway, eventually it's not going to be worth much because it's not going to work anymore. And it's going to need a lot of repairs to get it back to roadworthy. So when you have something that you treasure and you don't put anything into it, you just leave it on its own. In general terms, based on the second law of thermodynamics, things left on their own tend to break down. They tend to get worse. They don't tend to get better. Okay, so that's that's a law. That's not a theory. There's a lot of theories in the world, and those they can be proven or disproven. A law is a law is a law. And the second law of thermodynamics just basically tells you that anything that you leave on its own eventually tends to break down over time. Now, how does that relate to podcasting? When we create a podcast, we are excited about it. We put it out into the world. We put a lot of time and effort into it at the beginning. And then some of us tend to back away from podcasting and we do it less often with less of our whole heart into what we're doing. We're doing it because it's a job. And eventually our podcast just seems to break down in quality, in consistency, a lot of different things that impact our listeners, which then in turn our listeners leave. Because the podcast is different than it was when they first pressed play back in the day. And they've been following this journey of the show. Eventually the podcast just doesn't work or stops altogether. People call that pod fade. But that's kind of something that can happen to podcasters. I don't want to see that happen to you, and I don't want to see that happen to your show. So I'm saying to us as podcasters, when we create something, we don't create it, set it on a shelf, and then walk away. We really got to feed our podcast. We got to help it grow. We got to invest in it. We got to get better as podcasters. There's a lot of things that we can do behind the scenes to help our podcast not break down over time and become stale and predictable and maybe less impactful with our audience because we're not showing up the way we did in the beginning. So I want to kind of go over how this second law of thermodynamics directly relates to your podcast. And I got a few different things we're going to run through here. All the stuff is in the notes, by the way, so don't have to write anything down. Just check the notes on your phone. It's right there. You don't have to go to my website. And you can see kind of an outline of what we're talking about here on the show. But let's jump into it. Here we go.
Science!
The second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy or disorder in an isolated system tends to increase over time. This can be applied to podcasting, really. Systems tend to break down over time without external input, without care. Podcasts, just like anything else, can break down and lose momentum. They can lose quality, and they can lose audience engagement over time if the podcast isn't being served, built up, rebuilt, strengthened. It's not actively maintained or nurtured. A podcast can break down over time. The second law of thermodynamics. So here's how we can keep our podcast healthy and growing. And I want to draw parallels between podcasting and this whole idea of entropy or disorder. So the first thing, our podcasts require energy input, a consistent content creation process for everything we do in podcasting. Thermodynamic parallel here. In thermodynamics, energy input is required to maintain order and prevent system breakdown. In podcasting, how do we apply that? We need to maintain a consistent release schedule. Okay? We don't just create a podcast, do a couple episodes, and never come back. We got to keep showing up. We got to keep doing the thing and feeding the show and making it better, growing as a podcaster. As we continuously generate fresh, relevant new content, that keeps our podcast alive and growing. Okay, you with me? And as well, we got to invest time and resources into research and prep, and for us to get better as a podcaster overall. All of these things will help us to take a podcast that could be created and left alone. We could then nurture it and help it grow. We need to invest energy into our podcast and have a consistent content creation to what we do. What does that mean? Having a plan. Do you have a plan for your show, or are you just going week to week, episode to episode? You have no idea what the next episode's about until you hit record. Is that sustainable over a long period of time? Would the second law of thermodynamics have an impact on you if you're unprepared for your podcast? I think it could, because we tend to avoid work, most of us. We tend to avoid the difficult, hard things. And if podcasting becomes difficult or hard, I pretty well guarantee you're going to take a break from it, an extended break, which could lead into a permanent break. I don't want to see that happen for you if your intention is to create a podcast on a regular basis. So having a consistent content creation calendar for what you do, will definitely help your podcast not break down over time. The second one is all around adaptation, and that's evolving with your audience.
Science!
So using the framework of the second law of thermodynamics, isn't that fun to say? Systems that adapt to changing environments are more likely to survive and thrive. Any system that adapts to changes that happens around it will help it can stay sustainable and keep moving forward and keep growing and not break down over time. How does this apply to podcasting? Regularly analyzing your listener feedback. Do you get listener feedback? Do you have a speak pipe? Do you have a way for people to talk to you, reach out to you? And just looking at the metrics of your podcast, looking at your stats and understanding what the stats are telling you. There might be indicators of something where you're on the wrong path, or you're going too long, or you're going too short, or There's something happening in your every episode where people leave at this point in the podcast. What is it? Why are they leaving? And then find that out and fix it. That's how you're going to grow. Also, just looking at adjusting your content and format based on audience preferences. Again, if you want to do a 3-hour show, but your audience wants a 30-minute show, maybe do more 30-minute shows more often instead of one long 3-hour show. You don't have to do a 3-hour podcast, and you don't have to do a 30-minute podcast. You can do whatever you want. This is your show. So looking at the stats and putting it out there and watching what people do with your show will give you some pretty interesting feedback on if you're on the right path or not. So again, if you do a 1-hour show, every episode's 1 hour, and your listenership seems to drop off after about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, nobody stays to the end. What if you took that 1-hour concept, split it into two, and did 2 30-minute podcast episodes, and then look at the stats? Do people stick around now for 30 minutes more than they did for 25 of your 1-hour podcast? Like maybe as a simple change like that could bring you new, refreshed interaction with your audience. And as well, we need to stay current with the trends in podcasting, in your area of expertise, what you talk about. So if you're a podcast around speaking and getting people on stages for TEDx talks, then you need to be up on everything that's happening in the TEDx world so that people look to you as a source of information as they plan out their next TEDx talk. Because you've done all the hard work. You've already found all the articles and the research, and you're up to date on the most recent ways to get on stage at a TEDx. You're the expert. You're the go-to person because you put in the time and effort. Again, if you don't invest in your podcast, and it will, over time, disintegrate, just like the second law of thermodynamics states. What else do we need to do? We need to focus on controlling the quality of our podcast and refining our process.
Science!
Under the umbrella of the second law of thermodynamics, it talks about efficient systems minimize waste and maximize useful output. How does this apply to podcasting? Minimizing waste and maximizing useful output. We need to continuously improve in our audio quality, our production values, the things that we add to our show to make them sound better over time. This isn't something we have to get perfect on episode 1. It comes over a period of time. It comes as you learn your voice and learn your audience and then adapt. We need to refine our hosting skills and interview techniques. We can't just keep doing what we've done from day one, 100 episodes later. We have to be willing to pivot, change, and receive feedback, and then make a change. As well, we need to edit content ruthlessly to maintain high standards. If there's boring parts of your podcast, you need to carve those out and remove them. Your audience is not going to stick around for things that are boring. They're going to stick around for you and for what you talk about in a concise manner. So if you're the type of person who tends to go on tangents, if you never finish a sentence because you're distracted and you have that squirrel syndrome where you're talking about one thing and then you're already on to the next thing and you haven't finished your original thought, as a listener, that's very frustrating. So edit. That's one way that you can give your audience something great. Okay? Don't just create it, throw it up there. You need to do some editing and make it sound good. The next part is interconnectivity, and that's how we build our ecosystem in podcasting.
Science!
Under the umbrella of the second law of thermodynamics, an open system that exchanges energy with its environment is more stable than an isolated one. Oh, and as podcasters, we are quite isolated at times. And we don't receive feedback, we don't interact, we build in our little bubble, and then question why things aren't doing well, because we don't have any feedback and no back and forth. We need to collaborate with other podcasters and guests. That's why I do this show. That's why I have the How to Podcast series, because I want you, as a fellow podcaster, to come on here as a guest podcast host, co-host, and come on and share your thoughts around podcasting. Whether you've been doing it for a week or 20 years. I want to hear from you, and I want to get your expertise your questions, your comments, your thoughts. I think we do better when we do things in group because it's not one voice telling you what to do and what not to do in podcasting. So collaborate with other podcasters. Get them on your show. Get them in your world. Come to our meetups over on howtopodcast.ca and meet other podcasters in person on Zoom and be a part of the community that we're building here. It's always free, and we'd love to have you there. Also engage with your audience through social media, live events, meetups, like I mentioned. Give your community an opportunity to identify themselves as a listener of your show and then interact with them. And then cross-promote as much as you can with any complementary content creators in your space. Don't be afraid to work with people like you who podcast about your topic. So if you're an author podcast, connect with other author podcasters. We're not out to get each other. We're out there to help each other and help each other find guests and work together. There's a lot of space in podcasting, and you don't have to be so worried that somebody talks about your topic and that you're afraid of them. They might be your best ally. So reach out to those podcasters and build community with them. And then the next thing around this whole idea of the second law of thermodynamics and podcasting is around diversity.
Science.
So when we talk diversity, we're talking more in this sense around expanding your content horizons, expanding what you talk about. In the second law of thermodynamics, the parallel here for podcasting is diverse systems are generally more resilient to changes and disruptions. You get a resiliency just by having diverse systems. Let's experiment with different episode formats for your podcast. If you're an interview podcast, do a solo episode. If you're a solo podcaster, do an interview. Try panel discussions. Bring on multiple people. Have them come on. And what I love is when the panel don't know each other and they're all experts in their field, but they get to meet each other. You get to be a collaboration partner, bringing people onto the show and having them meet people for the first time and then have a conversation around a topic. That's fascinating because people are unpacking what they believe and how they disagree and how they work through disagreements. What a fascinating conversation than a lot of yes people who just agree with each other all the time. So experiment with different formats. Try something new on your show. And then watch your stats, watch your analytics, and then talk to your audience. See what they think. Cover a range of topics within your niche or expertise. There might be things adjacent to what you talk about that you've never talked about. Then maybe you need to talk about those things as well. And then incorporate multimedia elements, video, social media content, things that complement what you do. Not just recaps of what you've said, but additional content that reinforces what happened in the podcast. And what I love is when a podcaster grabs their phone, records a quick 1-2 minute video clip, and it's them talking to me as a listener of their show. I don't need you to tell me through an audiogram and give me a little clip of the show. I already have, if I follow you, I already have your podcast on my phone. I already know the new episode's live. I don't need you to tell me, but I would love for you to give me your insight on what happened in the show and talk to me so that I get curious about the content. I love that better. So try that. Use social media, use multimedia, use those tools to reinforce what you've done in your podcast. The other part we need to think about is some regular maintenance and some podcast health checks.
Science.
To help something from kind of falling and breaking down over time, as the second law of thermodynamics states, regular health checks, regular service and maintenance on what we have in our podcast can help prevent our system from degrading, and it extends the longevity of your podcast or the car in your driveway. Getting an oil change on my car will make my car run longer and cause less damage because I'm doing regular maintenance. When I get new tires, because my other tires are falling off, they're really bad, that helps my car be better, right? So regular maintenance, doing all the things behind the scenes, helps my car, the life of my car, to be extended into the future. Again, if I do nothing to this car and just leave it as is, it will degrade over time. Your podcast needs regular maintenance. You need to spend time making it better, investing, getting feedback, growing it, putting in the work, making changes, making sure that you're on the right path. All those things need to happen. So I'm asking you for your podcast to conduct some reviews of your podcast performance. You're looking at your stats. You can go to Apple and sign in through your Apple account, and you can look at episode by episode. You can look at your retention rates, which means how long someone listened to that particular episode. You can look at where people are listening in the world. You can look at on Apple, you can read reviews. You can look on Spotify, same thing, all of those. You can see ratings. You don't have actual written reviews on Spotify at this point, but you need to go in there and look at your episodes. And what I would love for you to do is look at the episode you released within the last 7 days and see how that's doing. And then when you release your next episode, you want it to be like a little bit better than the last one. That's how you know you're growing. Okay? To look at an episode that you released a year ago and compare it to something that's been out for a day, that's an unfair comparison because there's the element of time has happened. And more people have had the chance to listen to something that's 1 year old than 1 day old. So just keep that in mind when you're comparing and don't get down on yourself. But you should see some trends. You should see that when I release an episode within the first 7 days, I'm now hitting this number where in the past I used to hit a lower number. So my numbers are going up. That's a good sign. So there's a lot of good indications there. So review your podcast performance through looking at your analytics as well. Update your equipment and software as needed. There's a lot of great tools in podcasting. We don't talk a lot about tech in this podcast because tech changes every 5 minutes. So it's kind of irrelevant over a period of time. I'd rather focus on you and talking about podcasting from your perspective than microphones and stuff. If you have questions, let me know. I've got some recommended things that can help you. But really, there's all these new tools coming out all the time. So if updating your equipment makes your podcast better, then great. Just be careful. It is a slippery slope. And a lot of people spend a lot of unnecessary money on podcasting when you can podcast for free over at podcastforfree.com. Just saying. As well, refresh your podcast artwork and description periodically. Your artwork is the image that people will see on their player when they press play on your podcast. That can be changed anytime and updated. New colors, new look. That's up to you. You can play with that. As well, the description for your show is something that you can also alter over time as you kind of find your audience. So don't be afraid to get in there and change a few words because that's how people find you. So keep that in mind. Regular maintenance is going to help your podcast from breaking down over time, according to the second law of thermodynamics. What about energy conservation? How to be effective in using your energy?
Science.
According to the second law of thermodynamics, efficient use of energy helps maintain system stability. Okay, think about that. Streamline your production process, repurpose your content across different platforms wherever you can, and automate repetitive tasks where possible. Any of these things are going to speed up your workflow and help you to do things quicker, more effectively, and give you back the gift of time. As well, you can hire somebody to do all this for you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com if you're interested in that. And the last thing we're talking about here around the second law of thermodynamics, and it's kind of foreshadowing over podcasting, is feedback loops and how you can continuously improve your podcast.
Science.
In the thermodynamic parallel that we're using today on the show, feedback mechanisms help systems self-regulate and maintain stability. I'm challenging you to actively seek out and incorporate listener feedback into your podcast. That's why I do the question of the month. That's why I do these things where I put things out to you and I invite you to respond. Because I want your input in the show. I want you to hear your voice on the podcast. You need to continue to monitor your analytics, like we've talked about many times, to identify areas for improvement so that you can get better at what you do and your show gets better over time. And conduct regular self-assessments of your podcast quality and relevance. You hear people talk about reviewing your quality of your show. But what about the relevance of what you're talking about? If you're talking about something that's no longer relevant or as newsworthy or as in the public eye as you did in the past, it might be time to pivot and change or alter what you talk about or the approach to what you talk about. By applying these principles, podcasters can actively work against the entropy that naturally occurs in content creation as your podcast breaks down over time. Just as maintaining order in physical system requires constant effort, keeping a podcast healthy and growing depends and demands ongoing attention. You need to be able to adapt and add energy to your podcast. And this proactive approach to podcasting helps ensure that your podcast remains vibrant, engaging, and continues to attract and retain listeners over time. So go out to your driveway, look at that car that you haven't driven for a long time, and go, you know what, if I don't do something with this thing that I bought and spent money on and I really want it in the moment, but I haven't really thought about lately, if I don't do something with this, it will break down over time. It's a law. It is. It's going to break down. So I need to maintain it. I need to keep it going. I need to service it. I need to pay attention to it. I need to make time for it. Your podcast is exactly like a brand new car in your driveway. You do need to spend time on this thing so that it doesn't break down over time. So what are you going to do? How are you going to invest in yourself, in your car, in your podcast? What are you going to do to make this thing better and extend the life of it? I want to see you keep podcasting as long as you want to podcast. And I want your podcast to grow over time so you see the results and the feedback and the growth that you were anticipating. I want to see you in this for as long as you want to be in it. And remember, you don't have to podcast about your topic forever. Some podcasts have a beginning, middle, and end. They do 10 episodes and they're done. And the podcaster moves on to a brand new topic, starts a brand new show, and moves forward from there. If you are thinking about doing multiple shows, I would suggest you go to captivate.fm as your host for your podcast, because they, for one payment every month, allow you to have multiple shows. Each show has its own feed, which would then go out to the different players. And you don't have all of this different content under one umbrella. You can have your own umbrella for each show, and it's really, really great. So I do have a bunch of shows on captivate.fm. There is a link below if you're interested in them. And you can check them out. They're great people. And I would really highly suggest you take a look at captivate.fm if you want to do multiple shows. So you can do whatever you want in podcasting. It's all about you and your plans and where you want to go with your show. And as we take a look at this whole thing about the second law of thermodynamics, again, whatever you have, whatever's there, tends to break down over time if it's not taken care of, given attention, serviced, given all the things it needs to continue living its life or extending the life of the thing. And just, again, my wife and I just bought a rental property recently. We went in, the house had like bad plumbing, bad electrical, it needed paint, it needed new flooring. We spent like a month and a half and a lot of money bringing this house back to what it should be, and not, if not better than it was. A house is another great example of the second law of thermodynamics. You can build a brand new house, put it up on a hill, and never go there. Over time, that house is going to break down and get reclaimed by nature, and it's not going to be the same as it was the day that it was built. Your podcast, just like a house, will not stand the test of time if you don't invest in it and put some time and effort behind it. So that's the idea from today's episode. So I want to know, now that you've learned, if you have never heard of the second law of thermodynamics before, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this relates to your podcast and what you're going to do today to help your podcast grow. It could be simply hiring somebody to help you because you don't have time anymore to do this thing and you want to continue doing this thing. So maybe bringing somebody on board, my hand's raised, you can't see it, but bringing someone on board to help you to do the editing and do all this behind the scenes work so that you can do whatever you're doing in life. Maybe that's the answer. Whatever it is, howtopodcast.ca. Let's get together and chat. I'd love to answer any questions you have. There's a link in the show notes for my calendar. It's just for you, no one else. And you and I can get together and talk about your show. Okay? Please use it as often as you want. It's free. Doesn't cost you anything. And I'd love to talk to you one-on-one and meet you in person over Zoom. It's kind of in person, not really, but I'd love to meet you and have a conversation with you anytime around podcasting. Thanks for being here. Keep podcasting, keep being you. There's a shortage of people just like you in this world, and we need you and we need your voice in podcasting. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't have what it takes to be a podcaster. You do. You have an idea, you have a voice, you have thoughts, you have an insight that no one else has, and you're uniquely you, and we need your voice today in podcasting. So whatever it takes to get you to hit record and get your voice out there, I'm willing to help you any way that I can. Thanks for listening. Take care. We'll talk on the next episode. Keep podcasting, everybody.
She blinded me with science.
So you're a podcaster and you podcast alone. You are in your home, you're in your studio, you're in your closet, and you podcast. And you put everything out there in the world and you're thinking, man, I'd love to meet another podcaster and not feel so alone. I wish there was a way to meet up with other podcasters and talk about my journey, ask my questions in a safe place where others there are also podcasters at different levels. Some people have been doing this a long time. Maybe some podcasters are brand new like me. And I'd love to be able to ask questions and do community with others. Maybe find a guest for my show or be a guest and ask a question that's bothering me about podcasting that I haven't seen or heard or got an answer to. I wish there was a group for me. Dave, do you know of a group where they do all of that and they do group hugs, virtual group hugs? Yeah, we do. It's our meetup. And you know, guess what? You're invited to come to our meetups. They are amazing. Not because of me by any stretch of imagination. It's because they're great because of the people who show up. You're going to meet some of the nicest podcasters you've ever met. There's no judgment. There's no talking down to you. It's not about me. It's about the group. And there's many times where I don't even have to talk. Each of the people coming bring great expertise and insights that can help you grow your show, to help you be a better person. And they're there to support you. It's our meetups, and you can find them at their howtopodcast.ca website. Come join us. There's over 200 people in our group, and we'd love to have you there. Lots of room for you. Come be a part of our meetups and meet other podcasters. Don't do it alone. Podcasting should never be done alone. Come join us. howtopodcast.ca. See you at our meetups.